I think we had a fabulous meeting today. I think the Angela and the program deserve a round of applause. So no doubt that you heard today that we have some amazing emerging science and technology. And, besides human genome and AI, there are many others, precision medicine, regenerative medicine, and others. So we also talked about the fact these breakthroughs, which can transform medicine, carry risk. And the issue about the speed of adoption, implications for society, cost of care, potential to aggravate inequity, and challenging social norms and ethics. So I think this session is talking about what are we going to do about this? And I think all of us agree that we need to be more proactive, we need to be forward-looking, and we need to understand these issues, and we need to create some kind of a framework around this, particularly looking at issues of mitigating risk. So we've been able to assemble 5 outstanding panelists who are here today. And before I introduce them, I'd like to give them a charge. I know each one of you, given your current or past role, has extensive experience interfacing with new science, technology, with transformational potential. How did you or your organization assess the medical potential of an innovation? And how do you deal with the potential risk? And do you feel that today we have sufficient governance architecture in place? Now, before you answer, I've been instructed by Dr. Zerhouni that I should frame this question this way. Imagine you, it's true. Imagine you have 3 minutes with God. What would you tell him are the top 3 problems or challenges in the area? And what would you recommend to him as the top 3 priorities? Now, first, I'm not God, but I will take the message to him as you answer the question to me.
You have the telephone.
I have the telephone. So, Elias, starting with you. Extensive experience at Hopkins, director of NIH, and then recently head of R&D at Sanofi. You've seen the whole range, right? So all the way from discovery research to the marketplace. What are you going to tell God?
Help us be better. Because the success rate that you have across the board in terms of addressing the challenge of diseases today is actually insufficient. And so when you think about it and you ask me what the magic wand would be, I would say there are 3 vectors that to me are really essential to move forward. And one is addressing complexity of biology and human disease. The second is what I call the conflict between complexity and precision, because as the systems are more complex, in each one of us, they evolve differently. And therefore, there is a need to be very precise. But how do you really become so precise? You have to have multiple technologies that you need to use. And this is what I call the convergence vector. So you have complexity, precision, and convergence that really have to work together. And we are not set to do that. So when you ask me what would be the magic wand, I think I would want to find a way to address some of the issues discussed today. Large-scale AI, large-scale biological complexity and the systems of biology. How do you study them? So what I see emerging is a need for us to have, on the one hand, very profound and accurate biotyping. And I don't say genotyping, I say biotyping, because you can't really understand the complex system of a cell, of an organism, which has multiple layers of complexity, from DNA itself to epigenetics to transcription and so on, all the way to behavior and social sciences in one fell swoop. So when you really say, what do I need to do to organize the scientific community, motivate it, fund it, to try to address this, not in a reductionist way, which is the tradition, but into an integrationist way, where you put all that together in biotyping, human biology and human disease, whatever, if it's with CRISPR animal models that are not just interventional models, they are also models of exploration. And then next to that, you have to have real phenotyping of the individuals at the precision level that we need to do to be able to intervene. Some of the issues that I see today is fundamentally related to the distortions that the system is bringing. We heard about the $2.2 million price for a drug, but let me tell you what worries me even more so than that is the alignment between the public health needs and where we are today and where we're going. And you know, it reminds me that in Washington anyway, what I learned from my time at the NIH is that many people make very rational decisions all across town, except that there's no rule of God that says that some rational decision is rational. And so we are ending up with an irrational trend, which is the following. More and more of the research dollars that we're spending are directed towards populations of fewer and fewer patients. We're going towards smaller populations to rare diseases. And I give you a statistic. In 1995, FDA had 50 approvals, 55, something like that. And 3/4 of those were for populations of 3 million people or more. 2015, there were about the same number. 3/4 of those were for populations of 1 million or much less. So the challenge that I would like ask to God to help us with is, how do we get out of this world where we are spending more and more money to treat fewer and fewer people at higher and higher prices? If he could help me with that, I'll be very happy.
You know it's got to do with incentive. You know that,
Well,
right?
yeah.
I mean, where people are going with drug development, innovation, smaller population, has to do with incentive. Right? How do you get reimbursed? What's the best way to get to that piece? And I think the companies are very smart. They're doing often drugs everywhere, at every cancer.
Totally agree with you. I don't know if Rob is still here, but there's also a risk-benefit issue. Because if you go to the rare disease, you know the target, you know it's this gene, it's this particular, and the population is small, which means that FDA has a much lower threshold of acceptance as opposed to a primary care drug that affects millions of people, as you said.
Vivian, you were the CEO of Health System Utah, and when you were there, it was widely thought you were transforming the system and that you had a lot of innovations. Now you are new role as President of Health Platforms at Verily. You work with clinical and the engineering teams to develop products and platforms that can support health system and also advance population health. Now, when you bring these things together, again, this question about the 3 minutes you have, what would you tell God about what are the biggest challenges?
I think he was kidding.
Go with this.
You better start remembering this.
A little note.
And what are the solutions?
Yeah, so thank you. Let me just start by saying that from a reference point, you mentioned when I was at the University of Utah, I was the CEO there, and one of the things that I observed is something that Elias has also alluded to, which is that I saw that we were heading towards, there was sort of a collision of the two halves of my life. So part of my life, I'm a research scientist, MRI, NIH grants, study section council, those kinds of things. In Utah, heavy emphasis on precision medicine, genomics, a lot of the genealogies leading to fantastic discoveries, and then at the same time, the escalating cost of care, changes in healthcare payment, such that the responsibility, the financial responsibility for the care of our population was going to be shifted into our laps as healthcare providers. And then all of a sudden, we were going to be faced with this almost impossible dilemma of how do we actually translate this phenomenal scientific discoveries into the population in an affordable way. And it became very clear at that point that until we solved the healthcare crisis, we were never going to fully be able to realize the potential of the science that we were discovering. So that really motivated me, that and a conversation with Rob Califf here at the National Academy actually motivated me to look into the technology sector, because I do believe that there is a need for really transformative, innovative leapfrogging of some of these problems. And what I thought I would do, what I guess I would share with God, although God would already know, is to examples of where I think the technology, I think it's always helpful to kind of have a very clear case. And one is an example that is really about how we're able to deliver personalized healthcare in a very precise way to individuals in a way that engages them to co-produce their own health. And this is actually a product that I know well. I'm sharing with you products from Verily because I know them the best, called Dzau. It's a joint venture between Sanofi and Verily, and it's a diabetes management platform. And this is how it works. If you are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, your payer, your Blues payer, for example, insurer, may sign you up for this. And as a patient with type 2 diabetes, you are sent a continuous glucose monitor, a CGM. It happens to be manufactured by our company as well. You can put it on your arm or on your abdomen. It can be manufactured by others as well. And what it does is it continuously tracks your blood glucose. So instead of the finger sticks, you can actually see on your phone, because it's transmitted to your phone, 24/7 your blood sugar. The critical piece of controlling your sugar, of course, is your diet. And the way this app works is you take pictures of your meals and snacks with your cell phone instead of keeping a log. And using a bit of Google AI, automatically recognizes more than 1 million different meals and snacks. That in and of itself is really engaging for people. It's just fun to go into a new ethnic restaurant and see if it recognizes your meal. For the patients, what it really does is it gives you this visual learning system for looking at your food and then looking at what it did to your blood sugar. It's been transformative to these patients. At the same time, a little bit more AI comes out in the coaching piece. So we have real coaches, real human coaches, who are supplemented with AI. Those two really create individual learning experiences, N of one, very, very engaging and very scalable. That's one example. The other case that I was just going to share with you at the other extreme is really the use of AI in prevention at a global public health scale. And I understand we might have talked about this in the previous session. I apologize, I had to step out. We're in the middle of budget season, and yes, Alphabet even does do budgets. So, so I just missed that. But it's on the topic of mosquito-borne illnesses, which it sounds like you just talked about. And this will be a little bit different because it's not gene editing at all. It has to do with the mosquito Aedes aegypti, which is the mosquito responsible for yellow fever, dengue, Zika, chikungunya. And in this case, it has to do with one of the most prevalent bacteria called Wolbachia, prevalent in most insects and in animals. And the key fact that you have to know about that is, one, with these Aedes aegypti, only the females sting and transmit disease. And second of all, the males that carry Wolbachia, when they mate with the females, the eggs don't develop. So essentially, our goal was to release as many males with Wolbachia, no gene editing, it's just they just carry the Wolbachia into the environment. We've done that now in Fresno and in Australia and Singapore, and with pretty remarkable effect. Now, most people ask about the ecologic impact, of course. We ask about that too, and we're not eradicating all the mosquitoes, and so far, based on all of our consultations, there doesn't seem to be an impact, but of course we continue to monitor that carefully. So those are two extreme examples, from precision personalized healthcare to global preventive public health, and I think both of them really demonstrate the potential of how the technology, AI, big data, could be used to enable us to do both the science and the translation of that science to advance population health at scale. So those are some thoughts.
Okay, but we do have to worry. So I'm going to turn to Alondra, because what you just said was just wonderful, but we do know there are many issues, as you heard earlier, about AI and even ecosystem, etc. So Alondra, I guess of all the people here, you're closest to God because you're social scientists, right?
You don't think we're really scientists. Come on. Come on, Dr. Dzau.
Okay, but so you're the chair of School of Social Science at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. And of course, we know your work, widely known for your research, intersection of science, politics, and social inequality. So based on what you've heard, and you know from this meeting, etc., we need your perspective So tell us a little bit of what you think.
Yeah, so thank you for, thank you to you and God for having me in this conversation. And I guess I would say, dear God, help us to pay attention and to be flexible. So I'm a sociologist of science, and my work is ethnographic work, so I spend time often with users, consumers, patients, and I've also I also do historical work, and I've been writing about genetics, particularly with regards to Black communities, for almost 20 years. So on the one hand, I've been very interested in the ways in which, particularly in the change to emergence of new technologies, Black communities are often overexposed to the sort of harms of new technologies, and then also sort of underutilizing its potential uses. And I think that that is a kind of dynamic that persists with you whenever you have the emergence of new technologies. So, but I would say that there's learning, even from the work that I've done, that we could have paid attention to. So I feel like, I think many of you, and why I'm so delighted that Dr. Dzau is having this conversation all day, not just this panel, that we've come up sort of flat-footed and feeling like we're behind, that things are moving quite rapidly. But I think there are moments that we can look back to that offer us a way to look forward. So a couple of these. So when I was doing my field work, I worked on the first decade of the emergence of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing industry, and I spent time with the early adopters, many of whom were African-American senior citizens, believe it or not, trying to understand how they understood the technology and what they think they could do about it. And this was in a moment in which I was spending time also with medical geneticists and with clinicians who would say, why are you working on that? This is ridiculous, it's recreational genetics. So some of this obviously is snake oil, to use Alta's word from the prior panel, but it was also the case that it was the kind of threshold into which a lot of people thought about genetics for the very first time. So it very much mattered that they would say to me, having the experience with this company is the first time I've thought about what the genetic counselor said to me in my doctor's office. Or having this experience helps me to understand what's going on in the criminal justice system. And so I was seeing in my field work in 03 and 04 and 05, what we now know to be true about genetics, right? Which is that the data travels, that there's sort of creep in the mission of it, and that people's understanding of it don't abide the domains that we as disciplines and scholars put around them. So if we had imagined a kind of ethics of genetics in 2003 listening to consumers, we would not be in a place now where we're surprised that an open science project around genetic genealogy becomes used by the criminal justice system, or that the sort of leader in the market for genetic ancestry testing is also a leader in the market for pharmaceutical research. But and so none of this should be a surprise to us if we understood that. I think another example, the way to pay attention would be, we're coming up against, and I'm sure Bob will maybe talk about this, the 30th anniversary of the sort of announcement of the Human Genome Project, right? And so 30 years ago, we tried to get ahead of it, right? We built ELSI as a way to think about this. And ELSI was, in its early, if you go back to some of the archives, ELSI was supposed to be anticipating and looking at things like what sort of genetic data might mean for not only the law enforcement regime, but for credit raters, for employment discrimination, for this wide swath of things. And 30 years ago, folks thought that was preposterous, right? And so ELSI becomes much more narrow, but still very effective. And if we can think of something like the GINA Act of 2008 as being an outcome of that, we're in good stead. But we lost an opportunity there to, I think, to be anticipatory and thinking about what a new emergent science and technology might do. So I would say for us, the pay attention and the be flexible is to stay out of our silos, understand, I think, as we've been discussing today, that these new forms of technology, particularly when we're dealing with database technologies, are existing all around us in many social domains simultaneously, and that we need to think about that. And that sometimes we actually have good instincts about what we might do to get ahead of these things, but we don't listen to ourselves.
We'd like to talk about that. Scott, I'm not going to ask you to talk to God.
Is there a difference?
We were commenting when you said on the pre-call that you would ask us to talk to God. We thought that was aspirational, not literal. So,
if you like, you can go ahead and do it.
I didn't come prepared.
Okay, but I think that generally, people agree that you've done really a great job with an FDA commissioner. You're proactive, taking on important issues. But also, I think people are saying these days that science technology is outpacing governance and regulation, right? It's moving so fast. Is one of the regulatory agencies, FDA, moving fast enough with it? Do you lose any sleep over it, or did you lose any sleep over it? And what do you think about the discussion we've had all day? You know, how do you see it from that point of view?
I think I didn't lose sleep over it. I think historically we've been sometimes the temptation has been to try to fit the traditional approach to regulation to new technology, in part because it was seen as more efficient, in part because there was a reluctance to have to embrace the regulatory process, the rulemaking process, or Capitol Hill in order to get new authorities or issue new regulations to try to deal with the new technology, because you knew that was going to take time, it was going to open up the political process, you might engender some opposition, and so you tried to sort of take the rules you had and retrofit them to the new technology. And I think what we try to do was systematically look across the areas of new technology and recognize where we needed to develop brand new policy, brand new approaches to regulation, and go out and pursue it. With respect to gene therapy and CRISPR and gene editing, the issues there are going to be questions around not necessarily the clinical portion of the review, but the product portion of the review. Are there off-target effects? What are the durability of the treatments? The traditional approach to regulation might not be an adequate way to answer those questions. What you want is, these products are being put into very compelling clinical situations where there's an imperative to get the treatments to the patients more quickly if you see a very robust clinical effect, as we're seeing, but you want very robust tools in the post-market to continue to follow patients. And so we looked at how we can use the tools of accelerated approval more effectively in that setting where the agency had very robust mechanisms for requiring data collection in the post-market to look at those long-term questions of durability and off-target effects. And in the case of digital health, artificial intelligence devices, even next-generation sequencing, these are so rapidly evolving that the traditional approach to regulation, where you ask companies to come in and file supplements every time you're making an adaptation, doesn't fit. And so we said, well, maybe we should take a different approach where instead of regulating the technology itself, we're going to regulate the firm. And we're going to make sure the firm itself has good SOPs in place for validating their technology. And so long as they're doing good validation, we'll allow them to go to market not just with new iterations of their existing device, but maybe with new devices altogether without coming in every time to require pre-market permission, especially for something like a digital health app that's literally sitting on your phone and getting updated every night. We recognize a lot of the new drugs that are being put into development aren't based on phenotype anymore, but based on genotype of disease. And people are literally targeting genotypic features of disease where the disease can occur in multiple organ systems or have different expression, but all have a common mechanism. So how do we develop a regulatory process where you can get approval on the basis of the ability to target a genotype effectively and not necessarily the phenotypic features of the disease? So you saw us move towards tissue-agnostic approvals in oncology, basket trials where you can study multiple different organ systems. For example, in oncology, a tumor arising in multiple organ systems, you can study them simultaneously if the drug is targeting a common mechanism that's driving those tumors. Before, it used to be cancer of the liver, cancer of the lung. Now we allowed for approval on the basis of cancer of a mechanism. With cell-based regenerative medicine, where we were stepping in to regulate that really for the first time, where the FDA had a policy of enforcement discretion and allowed a lot of small operators to grow up in academic institutions, oftentimes with very promising innovation, but it also allowed a number of charlatans to grow up in the marketplace, promulgating products with really no proven promise in ways that could be dangerous for patients. We recognized that we needed a framework that simultaneously was going to allow us to crack down on the inappropriate operators, but also develop an efficient route to market for some of these small operators, sometimes who were just academic physicians working within a single institution. So you saw us take very vigorous enforcement actions. We sent federal marshals in to seize one product. We closed facilities recognizing we were going to be sued, and we went to federal court to defend those suits, and that was no easy feat, getting the DOJ to back those cases. But at the same time, we put forward guidance to make it easier for individual investigators, sometimes in an academic institution, to file for a license application, because we wanted to say, well, if you have a promising product and you want to follow the rules, we want to make it more efficient for you. So we allowed, for example, investigators who are following common manufacturing protocols to pool their data and file a common license application with the FDA, and we would give individual biologic license applications literally to individual investigators. It would allow them to get a trial that was of sufficient size to file for regulatory approval. So I think in all of these cases, and there's many more that are going to come to fruition going forward, I think we need to be willing to engage the process to try to create new rules that are properly suited to the technology. I wasn't afraid to go to Congress to seek legislation. We went to Congress. I said straight away at the beginning of my tenure, we're not going to try to regulate in vitro clinical tests or laboratory developed tests as medical devices. The medical device paradigm does not fit adequately to these technologies. We're going to go to Congress and seek legislation that's properly tailored to this technology. And in fact, we were able to move bipartisan legislation in Capitol Hill. It didn't get passed, but it will eventually get passed. So I think we need to be willing to embrace the political system to try to develop rules that are properly suited to the technologies and not just fall victim to the temptation to try to adapt the existing frameworks and the existing rules because we're afraid to embrace that process for fear that it's going to take time. It will take time, but we need to get these things right.
Okay. There's a whole bunch of things all of you have raised they want to get into, but let me make sure I get from Bob. Bob, I knew you from Duke. You were founded the Center for Genomic Ethics, Law and Policy, and of course you're now at Arizona State continue doing great work in this area. You also serve on the Office of Technology Assessment. And so you have a kind of broad look at what kind of interface can we have between, the government, the public. How do you look at that kind of issues and technology? Do you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, so first of all, I wanted to thank the previous panel because I'm going to be teaching on Wednesday morning and the topic is going to be CRISPR. So now that we've got all the answers for that, I know, and my students are going to be so jealous that I was here. And I feel a little bit like I did on my first year when I moved into my freshman dorm and met, somebody who was on the Olympic skiing team and somebody who was the valedictorian. And I'm saying, what the hell am I doing here? And that's how I feel on this panel. I'll just follow the precepts of Mark Twain and Abraham Lincoln and tell you that you in the audience who have that same question have plenty to be worried about, and I'll open my mouth and prove why. So I was thinking about two things, Victor, as I was setting this up.
Yep.
One is the 50-year history of this institution. Over that 50 years, several technological waves have washed ashore. And I just wanted to do kind of a list of those things that raise this question, not just of the technical stuff, but these are the kinds of technologies, and I didn't want to do God, because I'm not that good. But I did want to think about, what would I tell my mom? What's the sort of thing that's going to come up that my 94-year-old mom is kind of curious about and reading about in the paper and wants to know? And it's coming out of the life sciences, and it's maybe going to change her life, or at least her grandchildren's life. And I was thinking, recombinant DNA, in vitro fertilization, human gene therapy, the emergence of the Human Genome Project and the convergence of computing and DNA sequencing, fetal tissue research, 1988 and 2019, embryo research, Dolly the sheep, human embryonic stem cells, synthetic biology, whatever that means, nanotechnology, mitochondrial replacement therapy, and CRISPR and gene drives. So if you were counting there are 13 technologies that have kind of washed ashore. And they have this common feature of spilling over into a part of our culture that is beyond the technical communities from which they're emerging. So I was thinking, well, what do we do about that? And what are we good at in the United States specifically? I'm going to do that first. And I think we're really good at least three things that are crucial to this discussion. One is we're really good at, I think, actually spending money wisely to promote good research. We have institutions that do a pretty good job of that. NIH and the private sector, things like Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Chan Zuckerberg, Gates Foundation, et cetera. We're pretty good at fostering long-term good science that will spawn innovations. I think, despite all the caveats that Scott and Rob Califf have raised, I think we're pretty good at, when we've got evidence, kind of sifting, when's it safe to go in the water? Is it safe and having a process for thinking about when we have evidence, can we assess the risks and make a prudential judgment. I think we're pretty good at that. What we are unequivocally the best in the world at is spending money on healthcare and wasting money on healthcare. And the federal government alone spends $1.3 trillion on goods and services, and we have, so here I'm turning from the things that we're kind of good at to things we are really, really not good at. One of those is figuring out which things should we be buying and at what price. What should we cover? What should we reimburse? And how are we going to mount the evidence that will make us, in 5 years, make a better decision about what we cover and what we don't do? So laying the evidence base. And I don't think that's going to map very closely to the emerging technologies that we've talked about today. So I want to put that aside. I don't think this committee that you're proposing is actually going to get into that. I'm just tabling that as something that's super important for the National Academy of Medicine to engage with. And I know that you already are, but that's another thing. And there are two other things for which I think the National Academies could be really helpful, but can only go so far. One of those has already been raised many times, and I won't say much about. That's international stuff. There are two functions that I think are directly related to what we're talking about here, and that's one that we've discussed several times. How do you identify these technologies that are actually going to spill over into communities beyond the technical communities that are generating them? And how do we think about posing the questions where those things are going to spill over into political decisions? So when Rob said there's a lot of capacity at FDA to assess new technologies, he's right, but those are usually the technologies that are going to go through FDA, that are going to feed into a technical community. I don't know of an institutional base right now in the United States that allows us to do a very good job of thinking of, oh, and what's it going to do for insurance? What's it going to do for this? What's it going to do for all these social implications that the technology is going to generate? And I don't think we're very good at that. And I don't think we're very good at packaging the information for people who are going to have to make those political decisions. And the second thing, and here I'm going to mitochondrial replacement therapy and CRISPR in particular, you think about the reports that came out on those two topics from this institution and also from the Nuffield Council, which I'll come back to in a minute. Basically, there are two criteria. Let's make sure that we've got evidence that it's okay, that this is not going to kill people and it might have a good chance of working. That's a technical assessment. But then there's another criterion, which is let's make sure that we're ready to go in the water. Let's make sure there's enough consensus. And who's going to do that? What institution is going to do that? That's where I think we don't have much of a capacity. So, where are we? Well, it turns out the world is watching. And just think about what's going on in the world right now. In just the last year, the Government Accountability Office has started off a Science and Technology Assessment Unit, the Science, Technology Assessment and Analytics Unit, and they've also independently started a forecasting unit within GAO. The House has said, give $6 million to restore our dearly beloved Camelot, the Office of Technology Assessment. That is a relic of Congress's, its absence is a relic of Congress's lobotomy that it gave itself in 1995. The American Association for the Advancement of Science has created the Science Epicenter to look at evidence in public issues. There's going to be a report coming out in 2 weeks from the National Academy of Public Administration. How should Congress get its advice on science and technology? We'll see what that does. And then there are many academic units, the Hastings Center, and this very institution that are thinking, how do we think about this? It's in the air that we've realized there's this gap, and we better do something about it. So that's a promising thing, and I think the National Academies can do a whole lot there. There was one point I wanted to make, because there is a very concrete thing that you put on the table for us, which is you want to do this committee. And I want to go back to mitochondrial replacement therapy and CRISPR technologies. The evolution is, as I teach this stuff in public policy, my thinking is the early warning stuff on those two technologies actually happened more from the Nuffield Council than from any US institution. In both cases, the Nuffield Council had 2 reports on MRT, and in the case of CRISPR, a report that was out before the national academies or US formal organizations grappled with those issues. Why is that? And I think this is where the national academies could actually do something. I think the reason that the Nuffield Council was out there in front is because they had a mission to do that, exactly that. And most of our institutions don't have such a mission of identifying emerging technologies that are going to spill over. And 2, they had the money sitting in hand that was linked to that mission. So they didn't have to get a statement of task and refine what their questions are and then go hat in hand to all the agencies and get a contract to start a project, which is usually something that takes a year or 2. They could just do it. So what I'm hoping is the message for the national academies would be use that model, have it as a mission to identify emerging technologies, and just don't make people go out and do hat in hand stuff. Just figure that that's something that has to be handled through some funding stream that you don't have to worry about.
So you're way ahead of this conversation, but that's what I'd love to get to, because I actually think there's a big need for us to play that leadership role. I talked about that in my president's remarks, goal number 3, and of course, we'll talk about that, how we approach this. But let me just summarize what I heard, a few key words. I heard distortion, your word, incentive, rational decision-making, anticipatory, and evidence-based, and spending and wasting and healthcare, right? So actually in there I packed a lot of different things, but let me just take on a couple. Turning to the thing that you've been talking quite a lot about, how fragmented our system, how do you address cost of care, how do you address equity access issue? My question is, how do you do that, right? And maybe the starting point would be think about this. Let me propose a question to you. As you said earlier, Rob says, is what the market can bear. Is there a more rational way of approaching this altogether? After all, I thought the question gene therapy was reasonable because, if you save a life, let's take enzyme replacement therapy, Gaucher, $200,000 treatment a year for life versus one shot of gene therapy for $2 million. But nobody does the economic analysis and modeling or predictive analysis. What do you think about doing that?
I think that in other countries, I've had the advantage of working like in Europe and here. Other countries have actually models. The UK has a nice, and at the end of the day, when you try to evaluate the value of an intervention, it always relates to how much do you allocate to the value of a quality adjusted life year. So in the UK, it's 40,000 pounds. In France, it's 75,000 euros. In the US, it's $150,000. So when you do the calculation, you come to that number, and without boring you with the details, but if you look at the gene therapy, where you say it's a one treatment, right? The PK is permanent there, Scott, is what you said. And then you have essentially the pharmacological effect. And then you say, all right, this is a 2-year-old child, there's an 80-year-old life expectancy, so I have 78 years of qualities at 40,000 or 100,000, that's $7 million. That's the most ridiculous approach, which unfortunately is being applied. Why? Because I don't know that the effect is going to be lifelong. It's theoretically lifelong. I don't know that side effects are not going to appear. And so, as I think Altashara was saying, that it is the most ridiculous business model you can think of for a disease where you no longer have a drug that disappears over time, but a drug that is there and may lose its effect over time. And so this is the kind of thing that you do when you buy a house. When you buy a house for $1 million, you say, I'm going to pay a mortgage, and you have that house. Here, they're basically applying the pay me first, but 2 years from now, the house may be gone, and the therapeutic effect may be gone. And yet, you're still paying upfront for that. It's a model that should be completely rejected. It should be really a mortgage-type model as long as the outcome is there. Mm-hmm. And the same thing applies to many other drugs. So outcome-based, value-based drug pricing is going to happen based on a consensus, a social consensus, of what exactly is the price or the value of a quality-adjusted life year.
But even,
Scott?
Sorry. I mean, we talked about things are priced to what the market will bear, and there's truth in that. I'm not going to deny that monopolists will behave like monopolists, and when they have a monopoly, they'll price to what they can get in the marketplace. But things are also priced to the cost of capital, and the cost of capital in this sector is very high. And people think of the cost of capital of developing a drug as the cost of actually doing the investment in the clinical trials to develop the drug. But the cost of capital is actually dependent upon a time cost of capital. How long is it going to take you? Because you're adjusting your capital cost for the time and the next best use of that capital. And you also risk adjust your investment. And that's where the cost of capital becomes exceedingly high in this sector, because if you think that you only have a 10% or a 20% or a 30% odds of success, and you're putting forward a lot of capital to try to achieve that outcome, when you risk adjust that, the cost of that capital is very expensive, and you're always looking at what the next best use of that capital is. Now, in this sector, clearly the incentives are outweighing the cost of capital, or we wouldn't see so much capital flowing and investment capital flowing into life sciences right now. But we need to be mindful of the fact that, you know, there are other uses of capital, and you and I have probably both been at the table when we've seen promising programs not get funded because the expected return wasn't sufficient to justify the cost of capital based on what you think you could charge in the market and what the market would bear. So we need to be mindful that it's not just what the market will bear and what you can charge, and you'll get away with whatever you can get away with in the marketplace. When you're making those investment decisions, you're looking at your cost of capital.
Yeah, I was addressing the issue of gene therapy, okay,
Yeah,
pricing, which
That's
is
right.
the 2 million. But this logic applies completely in terms of the total system of innovation. And if you don't do that, what happens at the end, you're going to impact innovation negatively. But on the other hand, what is happening right now is that we are going to specialty care, very targeted populations, because it's much easier to figure out the risk, and not only the financial risk, but the regulatory pathway. And as long as you have the ability to sort of price it at a very high cost, like Gaucher disease or things like this, the incentive is going to be against public health, because the number of people that suffers from primary care diseases is much larger, and we're spending less and less against that, including antibiotic microbial resistance and others. That was the distortion that I was trying to mention to you, and saying that the irrationality of it is that by default, we're going away from what the public health requires.
You and I have been doing this long enough that we remember 15 years ago when the refrain was that all the drug industry is doing is developing Me Too products, and everyone wants the 10th statin. We made some deliberate decisions in how we designed Part D and other systems to try to shift incentives towards the development of drugs targeted to unmet medical needs. And so, as a society, we made some deliberate decisions. Now, we've seen a dramatic shift in the investment, and now it's very hard to develop a primary care drug where there's good enough generics on the market.
Vivian, you want to say something?
well, I was just responding to this discussion around the benefit of having some data about cost per quality, about any medication on the market in the US. So clearly there's this very challenging question of the highest cost to drugs. But I would say that one of the biggest challenges I feel is that, you know, as part of the Affordable Care Act, PCORI was legislatively prohibited from funding research that actually quantified cost per quality. So the fact that our day-to-day medication pharmaceutical decisions are not being informed by cost effectiveness, I think is really something that we need to address.
Bob?
So I was going to answer one of your sub-questions, Victor, which is there another way? And the answer to that is of course there is. And we have real-world examples of it. Think about how penicillin was developed in World War II. It was not patented, which was an unusual situation because that's the model that emerged later. But that's almost not relevant to it, because the reason that penicillin was such a success story is that it was actually developed by fermentation stuff by the USDA in Peoria, and the procurement was done by the Department of Defense, and it's no accident. It was a needed product that was part of a war effort. And the drive for doing that was coming from the government as the first customer. And back to my point about $1.3 trillion that we're spending in the United States of federal dollars, we haven't conceptualized the link. Rob alluded to the link between NIH and FDA, but there's another link that's at least as important, which is a link between the information that CMS is going to need to make prudent buying decisions to our research apparatus. And CMS does not have the statutory authority or the wherewithal within its institutional framework to actually anticipate the research needs. And we haven't solved that, we haven't put anything in that chasm between paying the bills at the end and generating the technologies at the front end. And that's where I think we could do some productive work, and that would probably entail the hand of government.
Well, you know, sorry.
I'd just like to make a quick point that is really important, because you heard about the cost of capital. You heard about the need for what you just mentioned, in other words, having a rational way. The problem is that the success rates in current discovery and translation and development is too low. And this is what drives capital very high. So the point I'm making is that the help that I would want to have is an acceleration in understanding the complexity of human disease biology, which we do not. We do not understand Alzheimer's, we do not understand the fundamental cause of diabetes, and so on. I can list you many. So I think we have to step back and say, wait a minute. The real problem is that we're investing here when the real problem is our lack of understanding of human disease biology, and we do not have the structure to address it because it requires multidisciplinary convergence and it requires scale. And those are lacking in the US. So we have great ways to do things in the US, and that's what makes us flexible and adaptable. But we do not have, I think, the ability to truly go after this issue, which is the central issue in my view in biomedical research, is our lack of knowledge. We have to be humble. We just don't know that much. And so this issue is never discussed because we don't feel comfortable about admitting that. But I believe that if you could double the success rate, you'll have a huge impact on the ability to treat the population and reduce cost, potentially.
Alondra, what do you think?
What do I think? I mean, I think, you know,
right?
I think, you know, two words have been said: public health and the government. I mean, I think that, you know, part of the, Bob alluded to this a little bit, the sort of chasm we're having around governance is similar to these issues. I mean, you know, we've lost the ability to sort of have a kind of common cause around costs and around the mission of public health. And so that means that it's meant to be the work of individual companies, of individual investors and the like. And I think that, you know, we've got to figure out kind of a way to put that back together again. I mean, I think listening to Scott, if you play that out, you know, it doesn't get any better. The costs just go up, and this is to Dr. Zerhouni's point, and for earlier in our conversation. And so that can't be the model that takes us forward. And I think that we have to just be honest about that.
I don't want to talk about cost alone.
Yeah.
And certainly we know about equity. We know all this stuff. But I do want to talk about the unanticipated risk and unintended consequence of science and technology. Of course, they're interrelated. They're among the many things we have to deal with, right? So someone mentioned Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, right? We all know that story well. Someone talked about gene editing, right? And you can imagine the list that go down and be concerned about all those things. So my question is, yes, there's a lot of discussion. And certainly, when you talk about ELSI, right, you thought way back, what do we need to anticipate? And I also hear, oh, yeah, there are ethics center addressing this, but these issues go well beyond ethics into many domains. How do we actually take this whole thing and put it together? Your point about some of individual rational decision is rational or irrational.
Could be either.
Right? Yeah. I mean, if you think about the ecosystem, so many hands being passed from discovery research to translation to small company, large company, to development, to regulation, to pricing, et cetera. And of course, at the end, we start finding out, oh, we forgot this ethical issue or this unintended consequences that we're trying to catch up when the products are in the market, right? So talk to me a little bit about how we're going to move forward with this.
Just make a very quick one.
Yeah.
the worst unintended consequence will be an alienation of the public relative to science and technology. Fear of CRISPR, fear of drive, fear of this. And if we lose the public, we lose the mission.
So
Okay,
I guess
anyone?
I wanted to offer one in my initial comments, which is that sometimes we have ideas that we don't take, and I think ELSI could have been different. And yet we get an ELSI that's institutionalized in a very narrowed form that becomes the ELSI of almost all kind of federally sponsored science and technology. And so that decision that's made in 1990, we're living with the implications with regards to our ability to anticipate what was coming. With one thing I'd offer. The other is that I think that we're now using ethics to sort of sit in the place of lots of other things that we mean, like inequity, social justice, justice issues, and we really need to, I think, kind of dial that back and be really honest about what we're talking about, because the ethics that we're often talking about is the sort of ethics of the very narrowed ELSI. It's not the ethics of the ELSI that was going to take into consideration all of the different kinds of implications for society at large of new science and technology. And so what we've got is a kind of conversation now about sort of upstream and downstream. And so I think one response is, and I think this is partly the case, and I think this is why a kind of multi-sectoral response to emergent science and technology is a good one. So if you have stakeholders upstream, including folks, users, people from the community, non-experts and the like, then folks can have a role to play in the sort of design and implementation of new technologies. But we're also dealing with a separate stream, right? And so a lot of the work of thinking about the implications or the ELSI piece or the social justice piece is sort of siloed off from the actual conversation. So there's up and down, there's a kind of vertical, but there's also a kind of profound stratification. Like these are not the people and the stakeholders who should be involved in these conversations and making these decisions. And that's going to be a fundamental, we're going to repeatedly have unintended consequences, which are, the question is unintended for whom or to whom, unless we sort of deal with that kind of both vertical and horizontal stream issue.
Right?
Right.
So I wanted to read you a quote from Merchant and Wallach, and it says, emerging technologies involve a complex mix of applications, risks, benefits, uncertainties, stakeholders, and public concerns. As a result, no single entity is capable of fully governing any of these multifaceted and rapidly moving fields and the innovative tools and technologies they produce. There's a challenge, Scott.
I had to put out, when I was at FTA, I had to put out a public health advisory warning people not to CRISPR themselves. I literally did. It's up there. It's on the website. I never thought I would have to do that, and I was like sure that the Onion was going to pick that up as a parody.
Slide of it, huh?
To Elias's point, I think we need to have very strong governance in place, trying to outline carefully how we use technologies like these when the means for doing it is so ubiquitous. I mean, the ability to do Cas9, the ability to engineer recombinant bacteria using the tools of synthetic biology, it's pretty ubiquitous now. You don't need to have an advanced laboratory or be a multinational company to do this. You can do it in a laboratory with a PhD. So we need to have strong governance in place. I think we need to also have, to your point, where you were going with this, strong regulatory tools to continue to look at how these technologies are performing in the marketplace after they're on the market. And that's not traditionally how we've regulated, because the risks associated with these technologies are going to become manifest over time. There will be unintended consequences from gene therapy and Cas9. There will be off-target effects. We will have incidences of mutagenesis that get created by some of those off-target effects. We will have some deleterious outcomes from some of the cell-based therapies that are being used on patients, where we'll see tumor growth and other consequences. And we need to make sure that we have vigilant tools in the marketplace to provide an assurance that when these unintended consequences do arise, we're going to spot them quickly and be able to take action, and also make sure that we're putting these technologies in patients who are appropriately suited for them relative to their clinical need, relative to the unclear risk. We need to recognize the risks here are unclear, and so it's imperative upon us to make sure that we're putting these in patients where the clinical imperative for what we can accomplish by using these technologies is sufficient to justify that unknown risks, because we don't do a good job of calculating unknown risks.
Exactly. So, you talked about US being the great innovator and, right, tremendous progress in this area. I would say that's absolutely true, but most of these innovations will not reach human unless there's a market in our country, which means that those people driving these things are really looking at market viewpoint. So AI is a good example. Where's AI being developed everywhere? Silicon Valley and others, but not strategically by the government. Not that I want to be China, right? But still, my question really is, there's a lot of factors involved, including early investors to look at technology. How do we gain some real social conscience into that discussion about everything we do must have that lens along the way, whereby we can say, okay, if we do this, I know you can't predict everything, but we're able to at least forecast some stuff to start have early discussion, including people investing, including people looking for return on investment, including, of course, people running the digital technology, the biotech world, the regulators, the law, the economics, and so on and so forth.
So Victor, I think there is something to be said about, there are some things we can do. And one of the intuitions, we all complain about the ELSI program and how it's narrow and blah, 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 but there is one central intuition, which is if you have people who are paid to think about things, they're more likely to think about them than if they aren't. And if that's a good way to detect unintended consequences earlier than you otherwise would. So one, pay some people to do it. That's called research. And so that's a good idea. The other intuition that I have about this is on that question of when is it okay to go ahead, when I went through that list of technologies, about half of them kind of disappear under the waves because they don't stay controversial. IVF, gene therapy on somatic cells, they just kind of become incorporated. Eyeglasses, whatever, right? Another set of those, embryo research and mitochondrial research at this point, we haven't reached consensus, at least in this country. And maybe we're never going to. And it's actually nice to be able to put those things in categories of we are going to always have to deal with political disagreement and deal with that and make decisions anyway. And in other cases, maybe it'll go away. And I think I don't know how to tell those issues apart at the front end.
Yeah.
It's not good at that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about, you alluded to big data, machine learning, and AI. And I as somebody who is, I'm not an expert in this at all, I've just worked with people who do it a lot. I totally agree with your comment earlier, which is that if we lose the public trust in this, then we've lost the game. And particularly in concerns about bias in the data. So we know that the data that we're training on, the data that we're collecting, reflects the current bias in our situation. And what I've been hearing now in the narrative across the AI community is really, no, we need to take some responsibility. We're not just going to passively take these ginormous learning sets and then whatever comes out of it, comes out of it. How can we actually create processes by which we test these algorithms for inherent bias or for bias that is reflected in them? And I know Marshall Chin and others at Chicago, Alvin Rujkumar from and others have been writing about this, about how can we think about the principles of distributed justice and using our testing scenarios with our big machine learning algorithms to test whether whether the outcomes seem fair, say, across the different populations that previously have been unfairly treated, for example, or whether resources are distributed fairly based on the outcomes of these AI algorithms. So we can test the AI algorithm results for potential bias, and we can actually go in and try to potentially redirect some of those outcomes. So I think that's a very interesting direction that the field is taking. And then finally, I think the post-marketing on some of these AI algorithms is going to be doubly important for that very reason.
So this is encouraging, right? But what I heard from Elias and you is to say, let's avoid a disaster. If public have no trust, like Gelsinger in gene therapy, we got set back. That's fine. That's like self-enlightenment. But a lot of people feel that's not enough, given what's happened in this country.
But
right?
also, I think that the formulation of so certainly we want to correct bias in the algorithm and in the data itself, but that bias lies outside of the system, right? It's not only a test for the system. And so until we're able to work together to think about the sort of, the ecosystem or the ecology in which these systems are being built, we're never going to succeed in testing out or having the system learning well enough to sort of unlearn its bias.
Right, but I take your point completely. It's, I think, two steps. First, recognizing and identifying the bias within the data, and then trying to address it.
The point of bringing this up was not so much to, just talk about the sky is falling, it's to really prepare us in the context of your concept about how do we as a community stop talking just amongst ourselves and make sure that we also address the potential rise of an anti-vaccine movement that we know has been very effective and ideologically driven, impossible to really not say anything about it, but we have been flat-footed about it. And the same thing is going to happen with GMO and all these things. A prolific Twitter account that is being used here in Washington has been very effective at having a real strong base, right? You know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
So I can also assure you, that a Twitter account from somebody who's motivated to destroy a particular advance in science and technology on social or maybe, unfairness or inequity, how do we address it is really my point, not so much that it will happen.
So I know that there are people eager to ask you questions, but let me just say the following to kind of put a kind of a punctuation of this conversation. You heard earlier in my address that in goal number 3 in our strategic plan is to look at where science is going and how we can also address the many issues that we addressed here. I happen strongly to believe that we have an obligation as National Academy to do so. So that's why we're putting together a committee on emerging science, technology, innovation, health and medicine. Focusing on health and medicine, there are other activities going on in the National Academy and many others, but we will focus on this. But I think the main thing we're talking about is the anticipatory, multi-sector, multi-domain. Now, our hope is that we can create a model framework that we can look at these issues in a proactive way, and we're going to try to do it through case studies at the beginning. Maybe, someone asked about who's got the governance. Well, I don't pretend the Academy has, absolute authority, but if we do it right, that possibly this is a place for real assessment, evaluation, conversation, where we lack of one today. So that's what we're thinking about. And a number of you are going to work with me on this one, and I thank you for it. And probably ask some of you else to come and help us with this. So with that,
Victor, do you mind, while we're waiting for people to get to, I had a question for Alondra.
Okay, please line up. We're ready for you.
And
we got two
that
of them
is, so the model here is an elite institution that's especially strong in science, technology, and medicine, and also in the social sciences. But it's an elite institution that's trying to do something that we're all struggling with how to do this right. And what's your sense of the methodological challenges of kind of doing what everybody's calling public engagement, or let's look before we leap and be thoughtful about that? The cool thing about your book is you actually talked to real people who are thinking about how do you use genetics for ancestry, right? And you asked them, and you lived with them, and you followed what they were doing. And that seems like a really, really rich, is that a methodology? Yeah, I guess it is. But so how do we do that at the institutional level to kind of get a sense of, are people thinking this is okay or it isn't now that they've thought about it enough?
Yeah, it's hard. I think.
Can you make it really brief?
Yeah, I think we tried to answer that question in the 60s and when we created IRBs, right? But I think the challenge is that, having served on IRBs at Yale, you've got 15 PhDs and someone from the community. And so that's really not a vehicle for kind of true community or public engagement. And so I think that we need to think about, this is what I meant, that we have this sort of siloed stream, and how do we get beyond that siloed stream and really sort of incorporate it into the work. And I think, to Scott's point, that there are uncertain risks, but there are things that we can know, and that part of it is actually being willing to pose the question to others besides ourselves, although we know quite a lot.
You have been so patient as a Sam, so please.
Hi, Gil Oman, University of Michigan. It's been a very stimulating panel and day. Thank you all. Specifically, Scott, the approval by mechanism rather than by location of tumor, and the Verily effort to try to reinforce healthful behavior and decisions by medical consumers. But I've been reflecting about the celebratory approach to the whole anniversary year and the topics not discussed today, except for a very brief mention by Elias. To follow your metaphor, Victor, if I were to ask God for help, I would think about what the computer scientists call the NP-hard problems. What are the problems that are so pervasive that any layperson would recognize the need? And we seem to be just wringing our hands or forgetting about it after, actually, in this case, 3 successive annual programs. Alzheimer's disease, obesity, and addiction. We are not meeting the public's expectations of this powerhouse scientific enterprise that we're so proud of. And we need fresh ideas. It's not just from, torquing at the edges and fussing with the horrific payment system we have. These are fundamentally misunderstood problems. And we have to ask ourselves, what could we as an academy, what can we as the biomedical research enterprise, what can we as a society mobilize to try to reformulate our approaches to questions like these, and specifically these 3? Maybe you all have some ideas you're bursting forth with to address that.
Comments from anyone? I actually think you're spot on, which is why I think as an academy we are now evolving in a rapid pace to look at new models, not just simply gathering reports, but finding ways to really engage public, engage others, and to collectively try to find solutions. And I think we need to keep going that way, and we need to find the big problems as we're discussing today and see if we can, with perhaps our voice and our ability to get people together, to solve some of these problems together.
What I would say is the issue I try to raise between the distortion between where we are applying our science and technology progress relative to where public health needs are. And I see an increasing divergence, which I agree with you, Gil, should be addressed more centrally as a core issue.
Thank you, Gil. I'm going to ask Sam first because he's been standing for a while, Keith. Sam?
First of all, giving God advice is a bit
It's the other way around. No, it's the other way.
in
What would you
fact,
ask God to
God
help you do
has
for you?
turned over the planet to us. Global warming is the largest challenge we all face. Unless we do something to bring the world community together, we're not going to have a community to deal with mitochondria or CRISPR or anything else.
Totally agree.
Secondly,
Yep.
I'm stunned that nobody has mentioned education. We're 20th in the world in reading, 24th in the world in math, 26th in the world in science. According to the PISA studies, we have a national graduation rate of 84%. Half the population will be Black and Hispanic by 2050. We can't have a country that is highly productive without people, all the people, producing what we need in science and in technology and agreeing in some way. So I think education needs to be very high on our priorities list, and how we solve the education problem there are many ways to do it, but I think the Academy needs to be involved in that, that some of the other issues are small compared to the education issue. Let me say finally that we have such economic disequilibrium in this country that it's going to take us a long time to solve that problem as well. And I think that is another issue that only education will be able to solve, because, in fact, unless we have productive people, we won't tax ourselves sufficiently to be able to solve this vast inequality.
Thank you, Sam.
You
Great
know,
comments.
yesterday Ann Case gave a presentation at our interest group, which will anticipate. There's a book that is coming out in the spring called Death of Despair, and the data that she showed was just shocking in terms of education, with or without a 4-year college degree. All of the issues that were discussed previously about whether they were addiction, pain, depression, all completely bifurcated around with or without a 4-year education. It was phenomenal.
Kid who doesn't get a high school degree lives 9 years less, 9 years less than a child who does.
Thank you. Really important comment. Keith?
Yeah, and I'll just add on to this that I think many people know that Sam has been developing teaching programs, K-12 programs in New York City for I don't know how many decades now, long time, that are really effective. And I think it's really an area where the National Academy should be paying some direct attention. We tend to think that we're up at this high level of doing research and practice, and that any problems that we have of, for example, diversity in our workforce really stem back to failure of our teaching at the K-12 level, and we just dispense with it, when in fact I think we should be having some real direct responsibility.
Yeah, I know that Greg Margolis is working with Sam.
Yeah, Greg is here, so So I wanted to just remind people of what Elias started us with in his puzzle to God, which was his concern about the fact that we are developing drugs for fewer and fewer people at higher and higher cost. And I would split that puzzle for God into 2 parts and say that in fact the first part of developing drugs for fewer and fewer people is exactly where we want to be going. That is to say that as precision medicine advances and we better understand mechanisms of disease, and in fact, what we'll really be understanding is the combination of factors that lead to the risk and incidence and progression of disease in different individuals, then all diseases will become rare, right? And the challenge for the pharmaceutical industry will simply be to deal with that. Going back to Victor's point, that you really need incentive, the payers are not going to reimburse for drugs that we know through better understanding of mechanisms are not effective. And so the drug companies are going to have to respond to that. I think there are approaches. You and I have talked a little bit about new approaches for the pharma model that are probably going to have to be at least considered. There are things that can be done. So just to mention an obvious one, and that is that we understand now that combination therapies are really increasingly not just effective, but essential for treatment of a range of diseases, and that's going to continue. And as precision medicine begins to factor in an understanding of what social forces are contributing to disease, and so it's not just genetics and its exposure and incidence and so forth, that maybe we're going to have combination drugs, combination therapies for every disease that are being able to attack these different components that are affecting disease. Yeah. Something like this is going to go forward. And Scott's move at the FDA to really be mechanism-based is really the right way to be going. I think that's really where we want to be going. So we want to be able to have that sectoring of being able to do practice medicine and do drug therapy.
Quick reply, and you're completely right. That's the trend. That's what I said, complexity going to precision. However, what is the problem is we can't do that at the expense of the greater burden of disease in the society. But I'm also making the second point, and that is that if you really notice, yes, we are going to more rare diseases and cancer therapies and immunology, things that we understand better, including with combination. But, you know, a key statistic is that the number of approvals is not skyrocketing. And the reason it's not skyrocketing is because our base knowledge is still insufficient. And we still have to really focus on the fact that we humbly recognize that we do not know enough to be effective with these new technologies.
Yeah, the more we understand about mechanisms, in fact, the more effective our trials will be, the lower costs will be for development, and that's going to be the solution.
I'd just add that, you know, and I agree with your analysis wholeheartedly. I think that one of the challenges is that a lot of the costs in development are fixed costs, and so they don't titrate with the size of the market that you're going after. So it's a challenge to try to develop products for small markets at a lower cost.
So time is constrained. Let's take short questions. Over there, please.
Hi, I'm Bhagwan Agarwal, program analyst from Commonwealth. I'd say it's a more comment than question, but it has two like root or main ideas behind it. One is like regulations. Like a previous panel, we talked about gene editing and regulation or ethics. In the science community, I think what I experience is there is a, graduate school, you have a PhD. But after that, and PhD is highly variable depending on your PI or on lab you do it. But then it's kind of became a market force. People try to see the opportunity and try to utilize it. So my comment or my idea is, why not we create a accreditation system, like for other, any other profession like medical or lawyer. Let's the research have accreditation system. Let's build a society where we can license. Any PhD will get a practitioner, will have a number or registry, so that you can implement code of ethics, you can implement CME, and you can have more self-compliance. So that's kind of field we should think about at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Alondra, you want to respond or no?
No, I don't. Thank you for that. It's a good idea.
Thank you very much. Al.
Albert Reese, University of Maryland. I want to just a little takeoff of the comment Gil made earlier. And I wonder whether we aren't being bold enough. And there is sufficient powerful technologies that we have developed and has evolved over the years. And I hear very little aspirational comments about cures by so-and-so. Vivian made a very nice analogy to the continuous glucose monitoring that has been used by Verily. And I wonder whether one couldn't extend that by saying, using technology X, using CGM, for example, we plan by X to have significant advances, eradication, control. May not be cure, but control. And I just wonder whether with these technologies, we continue to sort of nibble on the edges. Now, Elias is right that our knowledge is limited, so maybe as a consequence, our aspirations are also limited. But I just would challenge you and ask, there are a lot of powerful technologies, and wouldn't you think it's reasonable to be a little bit more bold and put in goals and roadmaps, milestones that you want to achieve? Again, within our entire society, we should have at least the horsepower to be able to accomplish that. I'd love to hear comments on that.
Thank you. Any comments?
I feel like there's a difference, Al, between what we're talking about on the discovery science side and then the implementation side. So what we're talking about with CGMs and the field generally of mobile health with sensors and technologies that can enable individuals to track their own progress, provide that feedback, provide that engagement, which essentially we're missing for most people. We know cardiologists know how to treat hypertension, internists know how to, primary care physicians know how to treat these, but it's an implementation problem, and I think that's where there's an enormous amount of opportunity, because we're really talking about population health that can be personalized at scale, creating access, overcoming access challenges. The problem, I think, is alignment between in our payer model. Because many of these investments, so the investments in the CGM or in other chronic disease management, the return is multi-years out. So you have to get alignment between your payer model or your employer paying on an annual basis looking for that return in a very limited period of time. So we have some things to work out, but I think we're very ambitious in that mobile health space generally across the field, sure.
Let's take some very short questions because we really have to close this meeting. Please.
Thank you, Victor. I appreciate your leadership, especially with the collaborative efforts with the committee, especially with it being interdisciplinary and perhaps engaging other agencies, as Scott may have implied, because of his interest in looking at the consumers of healthcare delivery. One of those consumers in entrustment with the taxpayers are our clinicians. As we have discussed earlier, frequently the data looks at supporting and protecting patients. But we are now at an opportunity in terms of stewardship of looking at the implications of how we can help our clinicians better serve, especially residents who are being burned out. And so I submit for consideration a task force that would actually consider and hope that that might be brought forward with case studies. Thank you.
So I think that's really, really important. Thank you.
Richard Johnston, University of Colorado. Just a quick follow-up on what Sam Silverstein brought forward about education. The relationship between good education and good health is irrefutable, and it goes in a stepwise pattern. Starting, the prominent cutoff is graduation from high school. It goes on up at each level. What seems to be the mechanism is the health behaviors improve the better educated you are. So what's happening in the United States when we have a population that is not adequately educated is they're presenting in their adult lives with preventable diseases because they smoke more, they're obese, they haven't exercised, they haven't eaten good food. And there are data in all of those categories, CDC and otherwise. So the medical profession hasn't picked up on that, basically. They haven't started lobbying through our associations. And the physicians themselves have an opportunity at every clinic visit to promote education, get adult education, what have you. The Academy is edging in that direction to say something that they've been fooling with since Harvey and in a good way. But if the medical profession can use its influence and its respect to stand up for better education, maybe we can make some progress in health.
Let's do it. Let's do it together. Last comment.
Yeah. Myron Alukian, Harvard. I want to reaffirm what the last speaker said and what Gil Oman started speaking about. How can science and technology make an impact on the public health problems of this country? 1 out of 3 children are either obese or overweight, 2 out of 3 adults. 480,000 people are dying a year from tobacco. Roughly 20 to 25% of kids are using e-cigarettes. We're not educating our children. They don't know how to make healthy choices. And I think we need to look at what are we doing with our money. We spend more money than any other nation in the country. We spend less than 3% for prevention of the health dollar, less than 3%. We have to go back to basic public health, basic prevention. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So Victor, can I just say one thing?
Yes.
Because I think there's been such a chorus of making similar point about the kind of social determinants of health, and I think it's worth saying something about, as the Academy moves forward and thinking about the role of science and technology, to also be thinking about these fundamental questions, and that that these questions of science and technology are answers to these questions, and so to maybe try to keep those in the front of mind.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Can you join me in thanking a great panel?